Hello, thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Jesse Howard, and I am a FileMaker and web developer at Codence. Today, we're going to be talking about the while calculation function introduced in FileMaker 18. The while function is a fantastic recursive programming tool. It allows lots of different ways for programmers to take something that they need to have recursively calculated without needing to use looping or other recursive custom functions like we've had to do in the past. So let's go ahead and jump right in. If we go into our data viewer, included under the Tools menu in all copies of FileMaker Pro Advanced, under the Watch tab and the plus sign, we can test out any function to more easily see what it's doing and learn if what we want to do is going to work. So if we do WHI, there we go, while, you'll notice that the while calculation has 4 different parameters. And if you've used functions in FileMaker before, you've probably learned that anytime a function has square brackets around a parameter, that means that that parameter accepts multiple arguments. So here within our while calculation, we have the first parameter is our initial variables. You can have one or more of those. You have your condition, basically while that condition is true, if you will, then run the logic. And this is essentially the area of the parameter, if you will, that is getting repeated over and over. And again, since it's in square brackets, that means you could have multiple arguments of logic for your while calculation. And then last but not least, once the condition is not true, then give us the final result. So that's the basic structure of the while calculation, but let's play with it a little deeper. So if I cancel this, I took the liberty of taking the while calculation and breaking it out a little bit with some comments and a very, very simple example, just so we can kind of go through this pretty quickly. So first we have our variables, then we have our condition that we're checking against. As long as that condition is true, loop through our logic arguments. And then once that condition is not true, give us our final result, which in this case, I just happened to name output. So what does this all mean? Well, with the variables, if you've ever used the let statement, you can define your variables to be anything you want. I just happen to choose the letter I because in a lot of ways it can stand for increment or iteration. And I set the initial increment value to 1. I have another arbitrary value that I just simply named max that was set to 5. And then here you might be like, well, what's going on here? I've got a variable called output, and it's set to an empty value. It's basically set to an empty string. Why do that? Well, there's some good reasons about that, and I'll come back to that in a second. But basically, our condition that we're checking against is as long as our iteration is less than our max, then run our logic. So down here, this kind of loop section, we have multiple arguments, right? We've got our output is equal to the existing value of the output, if any, and then we're concatenating a period at the end of the previous output. So I kind of mentioned like this placeholder value, like why keep this up here? Well, especially since in our logic, we have a variable that is declaring or calling itself. If you don't predefine it up here ahead of time, notice how the data viewer says, that doesn't work. It doesn't like that. Also, in a lot of languages, it's very common to try to declare variables ahead of time if you think you're going to use them. So it's just not a bad practice regardless, but again, use it as you will. So that's the main logic here that says, hey, append an X number of periods to our output. So if we wanted to start the output instead of it being empty to something like that, we can do that, right? And this exact type of functionality was possible with recursive custom functions. But I think, again, this is pretty clean. And once you understand that this is really a let, and this is kind of like an if, right? If this is true, then do this. Otherwise, do that, right? Once you kind of get that mindset, this really doesn't become that scary anymore. And you can do some pretty fun stuff. So that's just this one example. But what can we do with this, right? Here, we've got a list of contacts, and you may have noticed that as I click through these contacts, we have a vertical display of that contact's first and last name. As you may have guessed, that was done with a while function. So basically what we're doing is we're saying get the total length of characters of the first and last name, and then go through each letter of the name and append it with a return to generate this value. That's essentially what it's doing. So let's go take a look. Go to File, Manage, Database, and come down here. I just created a calculation field simply called calc vertical name. Here again, we've got our variables, we've got our condition, and then we have our logic, and then our result. So again, I chose I for the increment, set the initial increment to 1, and then while the condition is true, while our increment is less than our length. And again, I want the full length of a name. I don't want everything but the last letter of a name. So I added this little +1 here. You could just as easily do that, where the I is less than or equal to the total character length, but I'm just used to using +1. That's just a personal preference. Again, whatever works for you, right? As long as you're consistent. And then down here, we're basically saying, hey, the first letter is going to be empty. So we don't want a return preceding the first letter. We just want the first letter. So down here for our logic, we're saying, okay, set the output to be, if the first letter is empty, just grab the left letter, the leftmost letter. Otherwise, grab the existing output, append a return, and then append the next letter. And since we have our variable of I as our increment, this is basically going to say grab letter 2, letter 3, letter 4, etc. And then, of course, this is making sure our I variable keeps incrementing every time our loop is ran. So that's pretty much all it took to create this very simple calculation. That's kind of fun. Thank you so much for watching this video. In it, we covered the new FileMaker While function, what it is, its syntax, and how it works. If you'd like to see more ways in which this new function can be used, please check out our companion video, While Calculation Part 2, which covers 2 specific use cases for this function in depth and offers additional ideas on how to potentially implement and think about what this new functionality now offers. Lastly, if you haven't already, please also subscribe to our YouTube channel and visit us on our blog at www.codence.com/resources/blog. Jesse Howard, Codence.